Hi there, welcome to another edition of Gaming Memories, and today I'm turning my focus back to the trusty Commodore 64 and my top 10 arcade conversions for the system. Now, I've always been a big fan of arcade games right since I was a kid, and we've managed to plunder the archives of the family photos again. I'm going to put another couple of images up on screen of me playing arcade games when I was a kid. And these quite nicely span the era that I really enjoyed arcade games, which were from about 1983 to I would say about 1991. So I never really played the really early arcade games, the likes of Space Invaders and Pac-Man back in the day, and my formative years were definitely spent in the mid to late 80s playing the arcade games that were often put in jammer cabinets, lots of platform games, scrolling beat-em-ups, fighting games and shoot-em-ups. Those are the sort of games I loved as a kid, and they've been my favourites ever since. So as you may have seen from previous videos, I grew up using a BBC Micro, and there weren't very many arcade conversions on that system and very few good ones, although I am going to try and cover those in a future video. So when I got my Commodore 64, one of the main reasons I wanted it was so that I could play all the many arcade conversions that were released for that system. So when I got my Commodore 64 in 1988, there were already an abundance of arcade conversions available. Barely a month went by without a compilation being released for the system with a bunch of arcade games on it, good and bad, and there were also budget releases coming out from the likes of Hit Squad and Kicks with arcade conversions aplenty. So I'd estimate that at least half the games I had back in the day on the Commodore 64 were arcade conversions. That brings us to this top 10 then, and there was a few things I took into consideration when I was coming up with this list. Firstly, it has to be a game I like. It could be a game that I played a lot as a kid, either in the arcade or on the Commodore 64. There's also a couple of games that I've played later in life that I've enjoyed that have made it into this list as well. And the second thing, of course, is that it has to be a good conversion, and that means graphics, sound and gameplay all as close to the arcade version as the Commodore 64 can manage. And that's where this list became a little bit difficult, to be honest, because there's quite a few games that I thought were good conversions back in the day, but actually they've turned out to be not quite as good as I remember, and I've had to throw those out in favour of a few more obscure options, or options that I think are pretty decent. So without further ado, let's get on with the top 10 arcade conversions for the Commodore 64. So before we start the countdown properly, I've got a couple of honourable mentions, two games that didn't quite make the top 10, both coincidentally programmed by Chris Butler. First we have Ghosts and Goblins, released by Elite Software in 1986 based on the Capcom arcade machine from 1985. Capcom's classic platformer was a big favourite of mine when I was a kid, both in the arcade and the Commodore 64 version. However, the ridiculous difficulty level of both versions have made me realise that it's just not as much fun as I remembered. The C64 version has decent graphics and a great soundtrack that's totally different from the arcade version, but the first level seems shorter than its arcade counterpart, and the zombies frequently materialise right beneath you, which makes it all the more frustrating. It also lacks some of the later levels from the arcade game, though I'm sure the majority of us never got far enough to miss them. And the second honourable mention is Power Drift, an Activision release from 1990 based on Sega's 1988 arcade game. This conversion of one of Sega's brilliant sprite scalar driving games lacks the vibrancy of the original, but Butler managed to capture the essence of the arcade game with fun, fast-paced driving action that shifts an impressive number of sprites around given the hardware restrictions of the C64, which was pushing 10 years old at the time of the game's release. It's definitely one of the best racing games on the system, and the main reason this didn't make the top 10 is simply because I've not played the arcade version enough to make a fair comparison. So with those honourable mentions out of the way, let's get on with the countdown of my top 10. Kicking off the list at number 10 we have Solomon's Key, a US Gold release from 1987 based on the Tecmo arcade game from 1986. Probe Software's conversion of this relatively obscure platform puzzle game was one I really enjoyed playing in the late 80s, but I never played the arcade version until the last few years. Having done so, I'm happy to say this is a great adaptation that recreates the unique and chaotic nature of the original game very well. Most of the secret items from the arcade version are faithfully recreated, and the graphics and sound compare well too. It's a tough game after the first few levels, with lots to think about as you try to grab the key that will open the door to the next level, whilst avoiding the many enemies and collecting bonus items. The control mechanics take a little getting used to, but once you get into it, this is an addictive game and one that is perhaps a hidden gem in the C64 and arcade library. At number 9 we have Green Beret, an Imagine Software release from 1986 based on Konami's 1985 arcade game. I never really played this scrolling run and stab and gun game back in the day, either in the arcade or on the C64, but it's one of a number of Konami's mid-80s classics that I've come to appreciate in more recent times. Imagine's conversion is excellent, recreating the graphics and sound of the arcade version about as well as it's possible to do, and even includes the intro and intermission scenes. The gameplay is pretty much spot on too, and that means it's bloody hard. Even more so given that you have to use the spacebar for the secondary weapon when you pick it up. There's no doubt this game can be absolutely infuriating, but just like the arcade version, the more you play, the more progress you'll make, and when you compare it to the original, this is as good an adaptation as you could hope for. In 8th place we have another Imagine Software release from 1989, Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja. This is based on the Data East coin-op from 1988. By the late 80s, two-player scrolling beat-em-ups were amongst the most popular games in the arcade, a genre which began with Double Dragon, which notoriously received an awful port to the C64 courtesy of Melbourne House. Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja was a personal favourite of mine in the arcades, along with the legendary Final Fight and Golden Axe. A fish and chip shop in my local city centre had a jammer cabinet with Bad Dudes installed, and one Saturday me and my friend Dom shoveled several pound coins in and completed the game. The Commodore 64 conversion was very welcome back then, and while it does have a few shortcomings compared to the arcade original, it manages to recreate the feel of that version pretty well. It's sadly lacking the two-player mode, effectively making it Bad Dude vs Dragon Ninja, and some of the end-of-level bosses are underwhelming, but all the iconic stages of the game are recreated well, including the ones on the back of a truck and a train. Most of the collectibles are also included, and the moveset is pretty close to the coin-op version, including holding down the fire button for the fire punch. The game was multi-load, but it wasn't too bad as there were several stages in each load, so as conversions go it's pretty good with only a repetitive in-game tune letting it down a little. Retrospectively, this type of game is pretty boring as all you really do is fight and push right until you reach the boss, but at the time they were fantastic, and Dragon Ninja is one of the best that the C64 had to offer. In 7th place is Wonderboy, Activision's 1987 conversion of the game released by Sega in 1986. I became a big fan of Sega's scrolling platformer after playing it on a family holiday to Spain in the late 80s. As was common back then, most hotels would have a couple of arcade machines in the bar, and at our hotel that year, Wonderboy was the game that got the most play. By the end of the trip I could pretty much complete the game on a single credit, and so as soon as I got home I grabbed the C64 conversion, which by then had been re-released by the Hit Squad for $2.99. It may not have received very good scores in the magazines at the time, but this is a decent conversion of a game that I really enjoyed. The colours are a bit off in places, but the music is spot on, the sprites are well drawn, and most of the levels are pretty close to the arcade version, except for the 4th round of each area, which adds a section at the start that's completely different. Gameplay wise it's good too, recreating the fast paced action where you must negotiate the landscape and destroy enemies, whilst also keeping an eye on your ever decreasing energy level. Control was a little more tricky than the original, as with many Commodore 64 conversions you have to push up on the joystick to jump rather than using a fire button, but once you get used to it this is a great game for high score chasers. In 6th place is Ye Are Kung Fu, released by Imagine Software in 1986 based on Konami's 1984 arcade game. This is without doubt one of my favourite one-on-one fighting games, from a time before Street Fighter 2, where after every game I had to add combos, projectiles and special moves that I could never perform. Konami's game is pretty influential though, as while it was single player and you could only play as one character yourself, it was one of the earliest games to feature a variety of different characters to face off against, some of which had weapons or projectiles. It also has fast-paced action, a good moveset, charming graphics and a memorable background tune. The Commodore 64 conversion of the game is excellent, with the graphics and sound very close to the arcade original. All but one of the enemies make it into this version along with both backdrops, and the action is just as fast and furious. In retrospect, you'd have to say there are some gameplay flaws. Most matches see a resort to repeating the same move over and over.
Sweep the leg.
A couple of the opponents are infuriating as they can trap you in an infinite loop of hits that leave you defeated in a matter of seconds, Pole being the worst offender by far. But in all honesty, the arcade version has those flaws to some extent too. I played this game to death on the C64 when I was a teenager, and I could usually reach the final enemy, Blues, but found myself repeatedly vanquished by him and eventually got so annoyed that I whacked the handle of my QuickShot 2 joystick so hard that it broke clean off. Nevertheless, it's still a great conversion of the arcade game and always gives me nostalgic if slightly angry memories. This is actually the third game in my list that was coded by David Collier with graphics by Stephen Wahid, the others being Green Beret and Dragon Ninja, so it's fair to say that if you wanted an authentic arcade conversion on the C64, Collier and Wahid were a bit of a dream team. Halfway through the list now then, and in 5th place is Rainbow Islands, released in the arcade by Taito in 1987 and published by Ocean Software in 1990. Taito's sequel to Bubble Bobble is an entirely different game to its predecessor, a single-player platform game with vertically scrolling levels and a clever rainbow mechanic that lets you cast rainbows to eliminate enemies, grab items and create temporary platforms. The C64 version of the game was converted by GraphGold for Ocean, and they did a fantastic job of recreating the arcade experience, even as far as you having to add credits before starting the game. The graphics are cute and very colourful, spitting in the face of those naysayers that accuse the C64 of having a drab palette of greys and browns. The audio from the arcade version is also copied well, with the catchy version of Somewhere Over the Rainbow performed wonderfully by the SID chip. Gameplay wise, it's spot on too, with all the power-ups and collectibles present, impressive end-of-world bosses and the ability to cast a near infinite number of rainbows without slowing the game down too much. The gameplay isn't quite as addictive as some similar games, and as a result it's not my favourite of Taito's many cutesy platformers, but it is a fun game and the Commodore 64 conversion is without doubt one of the finest on the system. In 4th place we have Cabal, another game released by Ocean, this time in 1989, converted from the TAD Corporation coin-op of 1988. This is another game I became fond of after playing it on a family holiday. This time it was the only machine in the bar at a caravan park somewhere in North Wales, and I recall playing it a lot on a series of rainy evenings one summer in the late 80s. It's effectively an evolution of Space Invaders as you patrol a single screen trying to eliminate all your foes and taking cover behind barricades to avoid enemy fire. The crosshairs allows for very precise targeting though, and there's a good variety of enemies from soldiers to large vehicles, not to mention some great weapon power-ups and the ability to destroy most of the scenery. This is another great conversion on the C64, capturing all the mayhem of the original game and throwing a lot of enemies and bullets at you right from the start. It's technically very impressive with the number and size of sprites being generated, and the movement of the crosshairs is smooth, which is very important in this kind of game. Graphics and sound are pretty close representations of the arcade game, and while it does lack the simultaneous two-player mode and evasive roll mechanics of that version, it's otherwise an authentic recreation. Most importantly, it's a lot of fun and a balanced challenge, with progression becoming easier the more you play, and blowing up all those buildings with just a machine gun never gets boring.
Into the top 3 now, and in 3rd place is AllType, published by Electric Dreams in 1988, converting Irem Corporation's 1987 classic. Horizontally scrolling shoot-em-ups were hugely popular in the mid to late 80s, and AllType was the poster child for the genre, along with Konami's Nemesis. With the iconic R9 spaceship and power-ups, H.R. Geiger-inspired biomechanical level designs, and memorable end-of-level bosses, this has endured as one of the finest shooters ever made, and I'd argue that the first 3 levels of the game are as definitive as it gets in 80s arcade gaming. The C64 conversion of the game was programmed by Rainbow Arts, who had got into trouble with Electric Dreams when they released Katarkis, which was so similar to AllType that it infringed copyright. After tweaking the game and re-releasing it as Denaris, programmer Manfred Trench used the same engine to create this official conversion of the arcade game. Most would argue that Katarkis was superior, but that doesn't mean that this conversion of AllType is a bad game by any means. In terms of graphics and sound, it's about as good a copy of the arcade game as the C64 could handle, with some fantastic backgrounds, all the enemies and power-ups present, and the memorable soundtrack recreated brilliantly in SID form by Chris Hulsbeck. Gameplay wise, there are some subtle differences. A few aspects have been simplified due to hardware limitations. The game is more difficult in places, and some of the end of level bosses require different strategies than their arcade counterparts. It also has a pretty horrible multi-load that would have been really frustrating if you were loading from cassette, but that's the price you had to pay for such a graphically detailed and memory intensive game back then. If you're a fan of AllType in the arcades, then this was a brilliant conversion at the time that authentically recreated all the thrills and challenge of the original. In 2nd place we have Buggy Boy, released by Elite Systems in 1987, converting Tatsumi's 1985 arcade driving game. This one's another game that I never played in the arcades back in the day, but I absolutely loved it on the C64. I've since been able to play the arcade version and can happily say that not only is the C64 conversion a great port, but I actually think it's a better game than the original. Graphically, it was never going to compete with the huge triple screen monster in the arcades with its gigantic sprites, so it didn't try to. By scaling everything down to smaller sprites, the comparative scale of the arcade version was retained, and the game moves at a brilliant pace. Controlling the buggy with a joystick might not be as authentic as a steering wheel, but this game is all about precise movement as you navigate through the hazards on each course, and the joystick makes that control much easier. Other aspects of the arcade original are retained, with 5 different challenging courses to complete, and the iconic sounds as you collect flags and drive through gates recreated perfectly. It's not an easy game to complete, but it's so much fun to play that you'll be happy to persevere and replay the tracks, which brings the rewards of further progress. Buggy Boy has a pretty unique concept with the emphasis on control and skill rather than out and out speed, and along with the great technical implementation, that makes it one of the must play driving games on the C64 and a brilliant coin-op adaptation. And finally, number 1 in my list is Bubble Bobble, the conversion of the Taito 1986 coin-op by Firebird Software in 1987. Here's a game that needs no introduction or explanation. If you've not played Bubble Bobble, then I'm not sure why you're watching a retro gaming video. Anyone that knows me knows that Bubble Bobble is my favourite game of all time, so it should come as no surprise that this is my number 1, but actually it was a lot closer between this and Buggy Boy than I'd have thought. Bubble Bobble on the C64 is a great conversion for sure, and I played it incessantly as a child, but I've been so used to playing the arcade game over the last 15 years that when I returned to playing this version, I found it to be a very different beast. There are subtle differences that a seasoned player will notice, such as the enemies not staying captured for as long, so as a result it's a little bit more difficult than the arcade original, and the fact you have to push up on the joystick to jump takes some getting used to as well. Once you get used to the differences though, it has the same addictive gameplay, cute sprites and jolly music that made the coin-op version an absolute classic. The C64 version fits all 100 screens into a single load and includes the simultaneous 2-player mode, so while it may lack a few of the arcade version's secrets, it's so much fun to play that any minor niggles are soon forgotten, replaced by the sheer joy that is Bubble Bobble. That rounds off my list of the top 10 arcade conversions for the Commodore 64. There may be a few surprises in there, so please let me know what you think about my picks in the video comments. I'd also love to know which Commodore 64 arcade ports were your favourites. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, then please check out my other content and consider subscribing for weekly retro gaming videos. Thanks for watching and see you again soon.